And we people. It is the largest federal block grant to states and governments designed exclusively to create affordable housing for low-income households. So how do you know if you have home funding in your project? Well, you can see, and we're here in a test site, and if you weren't here this morning, just be aware that this test site is a little bit slower, this training site is a little bit slower than the regular site, so just bear with us for any slowness on that. These green symbols here signify home, and if you hover over them with your mouse, you can see who funded your home, and in this case, it was Home Program City, so the city funded home in this property. So we're going to select this property here, and in this training site, all of the projects and organization and information is made generic, just because we don't want to relay any specifying information about a property. So from the project details screen, and you can see that this page screen from up here, we're going to scroll down, and again you'll see the home icon here. And when we hover over it at this site, we can see that there's both home program county funds and city funds. So that means you have two different set-asides at this property, and you can't count your home units for two different funders. They have to be different home units. If you want to know additional information about your home funding, you can select on one of the home funders, so in this case, City of Seattle. And this will bring up the project funder settings. And if you scroll down, there's a home program section, and you'll see that in this case, there are three bedroom units required and two bedroom units required. You'll also notice that there's a configure by bedroom. Not all of your contracts will have your home units broken down by bedroom size. Most of the newer ones do, but always good to check here and make sure that you're providing the right breakdown. The other information on this page is your home period of affordability, first year, last year. The home program has a specific home period of affordability. For new construction, it's always 20 years. And for acquisition, rehabilitation of an existing property, the home period of affordability can be 5, 10, or 15 years, depending on the amount of home funding provided for that rehabilitation. So this means that this is a new construction, so there's a 20-year home period of affordability. The other thing that these start years tell you is the home program has a requirement around 6th-year income certifications. So what does that mean? So it doesn't mean that when a tenant moves into a home unit, 6 years after their move-in, you do a third-party income certification. What it means is that all households occupying home-funded units, every 6th year of the home period of affordability, must complete a third-party income certification with source documentation. So the 6th year for this property would start in 2016. So all households occupying these 5 units in year 2016 would need to complete a third-party income certification. And then they would do it again 6 years after that. So that's just a little nuance to know about home. It's different from both tax credit that requires the initial and the first anniversary recertification to be third-party. Home requires the initial certification and every 6th year of the home period of affordability to be third-party. All right, all of this home information can also be found on the annual report summary. So let's go back. And let's select the annual report summary for this year. And you'll see here that you have home program county, and they're requiring 2 2-bedroom units and 3 3-bedroom units, but none were reported. So keep this in mind for later. This is a problem. For home program city, 2 2-bedroom units are required and 3 3-bedroom units are required. And you can see in this case they reported 1 extra for the city. So this is the fastest place to look to see if you're meeting your required home set-aside commitments. So you want to see that you're meeting the minimum criteria for all of your home funders, especially if you have more than one, when it gets a little confusing. So now we're going to move on to how to complete home fields for a tenant that you've moved in. So we're going to go back to the project details, and I'm going to shift over to Table 1. And I'm going to get to Table 1 what we call the long way, so it'll show where all the tables are. So I'm going to select the site name. And I'm going to scroll down to Reports by Year, and I'm going to select the 2016 report. And now I'm going to move over to Table 1. So we're going to start at looking at Unit 119. All right. So you'll see when you first move in a household, and I hit the edit key, so hold on a sec, there's a button. This is a home program unit. So if we uncheck that, there's some fields that go away. So if it's a home unit, we're going to check it, and then these additional boxes pop up. So the first question, was this household living in the unit before the unit became a home-assisted unit? So what does that mean? If this property is new construction, then the answer would be no. This question is more so if it was an acquisition rehab where there were tenants living in the property before it became home-funded unit, then you would select yes, the household was living in that unit before the home funds were awarded. The next section is home unit occupancy, and there are three options: owner, renter, and vacant. And owner is going to be exceedingly rare. These are, again, cases where you have perhaps an owner-occupied mobile home that is also affordable and home-funded. But most of the time, you're going to select renter. Vacant is the option in the event the unit is vacant at 12/31, so it's vacant at year-end. So you'll go in and check this vacant. So in this case, the home unit occupancy renter was selected, and we could see this more if you look at your Table 1 Excel export, but the move-out date is toward the end of the year, and this unit was actually vacant at year-end. So it should have been selected vacant. The next is the home program category, and this is where you pick which jurisdiction funded your home unit, state, county, or city. And so if you have more than one home funder, you want to make sure that you're providing the correct breakdown. The next home fields are captured in the demographic section. So there's the home head of household race, pretty self-explanatory there. And then there's a checkbox for home head of house ethnicity, Hispanic or Latino. And the next is home type of household. So for here, and the user guide does give definitions of what these categories mean. A single non-elderly, a single person who's under the age of 62. Elderly is one or two person household. One or two person household with at least one person over the age of 62. Related single parent is a single parent household with at least one child under the age of 18. Related parent is a single parent, or is two parents, I'm sorry. Other would be cases like, for example, you may have two roommates that are living together, but they're not parents and not elderly. And then this is the second home field where if the household is vacant at year end, you need to report it as a vacant unit. So this is something you have to go back and check at year end. Any home units that are vacant at year end, the home unit occupancy and home type of household need to be changed to vacant. So let's go look at another unit. I'll look at Unit 111. All right, so yep, this is a home program unit, But what we can see right off the bat is that the home unit occupancy wasn't completed. WBARS doesn't currently have a validation to tell you that home fields, if it's a home unit, were not completed. So this is something you really got to make sure and check on your own. So we would need to make sure that if it doesn't look like that it was, the unit was vacant, so we would want to select that it was renter. It also looks like the home head of household race was not completed, so this would need to be completed for this as well. Home head of household ethnicity, we don't know if it was completed or not, but assuming it was and that the household was not. So there's something a little odd going around with the single non-elderly designation that was reported. And we can look at the household size as an indicator that perhaps a single non-elderly does not match up with the household size. So this is another area to look at and make sure that you're not reporting things that don't make sense. And we're going to move on to look at another unit. Unit 207. So I'm going to pause here and see if there's any questions. All right, so I'm going to take a second and talk a little bit about home rent limits and income limits. So there are low home units and high home units. If the restricted percentage that you select for the unit is 50% or below, then that unit is a low home unit, and the low home rent is populated. And that's going to show up down here. If you have a restricted percentage that's above 50%, so 60, 80, then it is a high home unit. So I'm going to read a little excerpt from the Compliance and Home Rental Projects. This is a guide for property owners. It states that high home rents are the maximum rents that can be charged to low-income households, so households with incomes under 80% of median income, and they are based on the lesser of the Section 8 fair market rents, or 30% of the adjusted income of a family whose annual income equals 65% of median income. Low home rents are the maximum rents that can be charged to low home rent units that are occupied by low-income households, very low-income households, so under 50% AMI. And the low home rents are based on one of the following: 30% of the tenant's monthly adjusted income, or 30% of the annual income of a family whose income equals 50% of the median income. And that option is the HUD published low home rents, and that's what is populated here. The third option is if the property has a federal or state project-based rental subsidy and the tenant pays no more than 30% of their adjusted income toward rent, then the maximum allowed rent may be the rent allowed under the project-based rental subsidy program. So we'll get into that in a little bit, but what WBARS does is it validates the total rent with utility allowance against both the home rent and the maximum allowed rent. In most cases, the standard maximum allowed rent is going to be more restrictive than the home rent. If the unit has both home funding and tax credit funding, you will always have to use the most restrictive rent. And same goes if it's a home unit and a tax credit unit and it has city or county funds. The applicable rent is the most restrictive of all of those involved. And so you can hover over here and see that it's pulling the 40% tax credit limit here, and then it's pulling the home rent here. This one is lower, so this is the maximum allowed rent. In this case, it's a 40% unit, and this rent is lower. And so even though you have a home rent here, you got to cap it at no more than that. There are some special rules for group homes and projects with single room occupancy SROs. There's a HUD CPD Notice 94-01 that provides some guidance around home funds and rent limitations for single room occupancy and group homes. I'm not going to go into those details, but if you have one of those types, please contact your home funder for guidance. Essentially, there is a summary in the Home Compliance Guide for Property Owners on page 57, and we'll provide in the PowerPoint a link to where you can find that guide. Any questions about low home, high home, rent limits? All right, we're going to keep moving along. Bear with me while it refreshes here. So I'm going to go to Unit 201. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the low home and the state or federal project-based rental assistance situation. So rents for tenants that receive Section 8 or tenant-based rental assistance. This again is from the Home Guide for Property Managers. It says households with tenant-based rental assistance through Section 8 or another funding source, the resident payment plus the utility allowance plus the subsidy payment cannot exceed the applicable high or low home rent limit. WBARS does not have a system validation for a situation where a tenant-based Section 8 voucher is in place. So you need to look at this on your own. So in the case of Unit 201, we're going to scroll down and see that it's a project-based unit. And if you recall, if it's a low home unit, so it's under 50%, so we're good there, and the tenant is paying no more than 30% of their adjusted income for rent, then the total that's charged, this amount here, can exceed the maximum allowed home rent for project-based only. And it must be a federal or state project-based source. So in this case, the total rent with utility allowance that the tenant's paying is below both of the rent limitations, so we're good to go there. The total with subsidy is higher than the maximum allowed home rent, but in this case that is acceptable because it is a low home unit with a federal or state project-based subsidy, and the tenant's paying 30% of adjusted income for rent. So we're going to look at the other side of the story, Unit 113, with a tenant-based voucher. All right, so in this case, again, it's still a low home unit because it's under 50%, but it's a tenant-based voucher. And we'll see here that there's a couple problems. Clearly, the resident payment plus utility allowance exceeds the maximum allowed rent, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the issue here with the tenant-based voucher is that the total with subsidy right here, $1,219, exceeds the maximum allowed home rent of $1,174. And that is not permissible in a tenant-based situation. And the reason is that rents charged to tenants with a tenant-based rental assistance must be the same as rents charged to other tenants in comparable units. Section 8 rules specifically prohibit an owner from charging a different rent for units occupied by voucher holders than the rents charged for comparable units that are not occupied by voucher holders. So this is just a basic fairness situation. So in the event that this came up on an annual report review, if I were reviewing your report, I would contact you and ask that you work with the public housing authority that provides the rental assistance, and you would need to have the contract rent decreased so that the resident payment plus utility allowance plus housing assistance payment is no more than $1,174. Any questions about that? So there's a few other things going on with this particular household. So looking at the income, $79,000. Their actual percent of median income is 81%. And yet they still have a subsidy and are receiving monthly subsidy assistance. So that by itself doesn't make sense. So if I were reviewing the report, I would ask a question as to what may have been going on with this situation. So that may be one thing to consider. For home purposes, the big challenge in this situation is that the home program defines a low-income household as a household whose income is below 80% AMI. So once the household's income exceeds 80% AMI, they are no longer an eligible low-income family for the home program. So what does that mean? Well, we've provided 2 exhibits, and I'm not sure if I can blow this up any further, but you have these via handouts. It's a little easier in an in-person training to go through these, but the resolution, the way to correct this situation depends on if your home unit is fixed or floating. So how do you know if a unit is fixed or floating? It should be specified in your funder contract. For example, in city regulatory agreements in the home sections, it will say either the home units can float to other units in the property, or the home units are fixed and so designated on, Exhibit A of your regulatory agreement and cannot be changed unless you get, written confirmation from your funder. If you can float the home designation, you have to float it to another comparable unit. And that means that the unit is the same bedroom size and has similar amenities and square footage as the originally designated home unit. So let's say that for Unit 113, let's say it's a fixed home unit. And so it's fixed, they're in a low home unit, they're over 80% AMI. So that means you have to rent your next available home-assisted unit to a very low-income household, so that's under 50%, and charge that household no more than the low home rent, and that's your new low home rent unit. In addition, as soon as the lease permits, you have to increase the rent to 30% of the tenant's monthly adjusted income. This rent increase could be quite severe. And if you have tax credits or another funder that is more restrictive, you still have to cap the rent at the most restrictive rent. But in cases, say, if you have a property that's just city funding with home funds and fixed home units, you must do this rent increase as soon as the lease permits. It's always helpful if you give your home funder a heads up, because sometimes we get calls from tenants for this rent increase, as again, it can be quite high. Any questions about fixed or floating home units? All right, so what if it's floating? So one thing you can do is just float the home designation to another comparable unit, and then the over-income household is no longer a home unit. And that's probably the easiest thing to do. I'm not going to go through, because of time, through this whole flow chart. It does get confusing, and to be perfectly honest, anytime an over-income situation in a home unit comes up, if we get a phone call for technical assistance, we're going to walk through these flow charts together and troubleshoot it, and then figure out what steps to take. It can be confusing given the number of layers of funding and requirements, I presume, in most of the properties that you're involved with. So I'm going to go move on, and we're going to look at the Excel export. Let me just cue it up here. All right. So what I suggest And maybe it would be helpful if I actually go back to the training site for just a moment. I can find it here. So when you're getting ready, if you think you've entered in all of your home information correct and you think you're all good to go, but you want to review and make sure that you've completed all of the home criteria correctly. So what I do is I run an Excel export. And I'm showing you this process because it's a little... See if it wants to run. So what I do is I run the Excel export, and then I do a copy and I sort it by, is it a home unit? It gets challenging to look at every single line, so I'm just highlighting and I'm doing a right click, and I'm going to the sort and I'm doing a custom sort, and I'm going to sort by, is it a home unit? And because it's a yes, I'm going to switch the reverse order so they all show up at the top. So this brings up all of my home units all together. So as an owner or as a property manager, this is an easier way to review all of your home fields and make sure they're all completed. So as you're looking across, for example, this home household here, which we talked about, unit 111, you'll see the home unit occupancy wasn't completed. And let's keep going further. You'll also see that the home race wasn't completed. And you'll notice that these don't automatically highlight. There's no magical WBARS validation that's going to tell you that you did not complete these fields. You're just going to have to run your Excel export, look at it yourself, and see if it makes sense and make sure that all of the fields are completed accordingly. Another thing to look at, this tenant before home column, which we talked about, I often get reports that have this answered yes for everybody, even if it's not a home unit, and even if there's no home funding in the property. And I suspect it may be an XML upload issue. So something to take note of if you're reviewing your Excel export before you submit. Just make sure that things make sense. And so if you're answering home questions on your Excel and you don't have any home funds, or if you're filling out home information for units that aren't home, that's something to figure out and correct. It's a little difficult to go through via this Excel export in a webinar training, but you can see, for example, Unit 113 that we talked about, this was that over-income household. WBARS is going to highlight and bold the income, so that's a clue there. And this is also a clue that there is a problem with the rent, that highlight. And if we keep going forward, you'll see actual AMI 81%. So one of the first things I do after I do my home program unit sort is I look down the actual AMI column and I take note of anybody that's at or over 80 or getting kind of close to 80. So I want to give you a heads up to look at that. The other thing that I look at is the subsidy type, and that whether or not the total rent with subsidy, so in this case Section 8 voucher, this is a tenant-based voucher, the total rent with subsidy here exceeds the home rent limit here. So that's, again, no validations are going to pop up in the system, but that's how we're going to look at it. So I go through, I look home program unit, I look home program category and make sure that the correct category is reported. Looking, it should be most likely renter, but vacant for those home program units that are vacant at year end. All of the home race categories should be filled. All of the home head of household categories should be filled, and they should make sense. And if the unit is vacant at year end, then the home type household should also be vacant. So I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint here, and again, we included it in a handout. So common WBARS reporting and upload issues. We talked about this a bit. So home fields not populated or populated inaccurately for home assistant units. That's very common. Home fields populated for units that aren't even designated as home assisted units. So that could be an XML upload issue. So be sure to run an Excel export, sort by home, and really look across your home units and make sure that all of those fields are completed. And again, WBARS does not currently validate for missing home fields or home fields populated for non-home assisted units. So we just all have to look and be cognizant that it's up to us. Transfers to and from home assisted units. So you want to make sure that home fields are repopulated when moving a new household into a home assisted unit. In addition, if perhaps maybe you've floated the home designation to a new unit, you need to make sure that the lease for that household complies with home rules and doesn't include any of the prohibited lease terms. So you got to keep those things in mind if you're moving in new households or transferring a household to a home assisted unit or floating the home designation to a new unit. Lanike talked about this a bit in the morning session. On the annual report cover page in WBARS, there is a home suitability for occupancy certification. This pops up for your authorized owner or contractor to complete prior to submission to the funder level. The vast majority of folks will check this section here to certify that all of the home assisted units in the property are suitable for occupancy. You may have a very particular situation, and if you've been given a waiver of this certification requirement from your home funder because the units are not considered rental units per HUD guidelines, then you would check this box. But that's only if you've gotten permission from your home funder. In July of 2013, Housing Urban Development published a new final rule for the home program. It included a lot of changes, and I'm just going to cover a few of them here that really impact actual operations. The home final rule included other changes with respect to how home funds are allocated and the amount of home funds awarded and many other things, but we're just going to focus on things that impact how you operate a property that's already in operations. And these include, and all were effective in August of 2013, student eligibility, income determinations, lease prohibitions, and utility allowances. So part of the new final rule added a reference to the HUD Section 8 definition of students to the definition of a eligible low-income family for home. And I've included that full Section 8 definition of student. This definition is different from your tax credit definition. It includes part-time or full-time, and it is fairly specific. So if you're familiar with operating properties with Section 8 involvement, you're probably already familiar with this definition, and you just got to kind of work through it. So there was a little bit of confusion when the home final rule first came out, and the way that it was interpreted by home funders throughout the state of Washington is that the new student eligibility rule only applied to newly funded home projects, so projects that had home funds committed after the home final rule was published. But in January of 2015, HUD issued some clarifying guidance that said that this new definition actually applies to all home projects regardless of when funds were committed. So if you have a project that the city awarded home funds to 15 years ago, this new requirement around student eligibility applies to those programs too. We also confirmed with our local CDP rep that this provision, they informed us, had always been a requirement of the home program, regardless of when program funds were committed. So there was some confusion, and we apologize that if we provided some confusing guidance initially, but HUD has absolutely clarified that this applies to all home-funded projects now. But wait, we're not done. So student eligibility continued. In September of 2016, HUD published a notice entitled Eligibility of Independent Students for Assistance under Section 8 of the U.S. Housing Act of 1937. So this notice brought HUD's guidance into conformity with the updated definition of independent student that's included under the Higher Education Act of 1965 and the U.S. Department of Education's definition. So this guidance was specific, focusing on students under the age of 24 who were individually seeking to reside in assisted unit, either home or Section 8. And this notice, which is published in that Federal Register, the link right there, also includes guidance on how to verify a student's independent status. This Federal Register link, it's only a couple pages long. I know nobody, including myself, has particular affinity to reading Federal Register, but I would really suggest giving it a read for yourself because it does include some helpful information about how to actually go about verifying whether or not the student's independent status. And for the full definition, here you go. I'm not going to read it for you. It's quite long, but this is now the definition of independent student that applies. Any questions about student eligibility? All right, so a few of the things that changed. They made clear in this new final rule that owners must examine at least 2 months of source documentation, such as wage statements, unemployment compensation documentation, when determining household income for all household members. So 2 months source documentation. It also clarified that mandatory services are only permitted in transitional housing programs. So if you have a program with home funds and the housing is permanent in nature and not transitional, you cannot require tenants to participate in services as a condition of their lease and continued housing. So this is just something to be aware of and to review the lease prohibitions. The city on our website, we also have, and other funders have distributed a home program lease addendum that can be used that makes this very clear. So if you'd rather not revise your entire lease to comply with home, you can use the home lease addendum in lieu. The other big change, and we're still getting information about it, is utility allowances. So under the home final rule, PJs, which is short for participating jurisdictions, which is the fancy name of calling your home funder. So City of Seattle, for example, is a participating jurisdiction. We're no longer allowed to use the utility allowances established by the local public housing authority for home assistance rental projects for which home funds were committed on or after August 23rd, 2013. So the impact on this thus far doesn't look like it's huge, but it does impact all of our newly funded home projects. There are 2 links below to resources on what utility allowance models are permitted, as well as a full webinar available. We submitted questions to HUD for additional guidance, and it's taken a while for HUD to roll out that guidance, but what we have is those 2 links below. In addition, State Commerce is taking the lead on developing a utility allowance policy that outlines the eligible utility allowance models, and other home funders in the state are reviewing that, and we're hoping that we'll be able to release some joint guidance so as to not confuse all of you and ourselves about all of the different eligible options for utility allowances. Many of them align with the different alternative models that the Finance Commission permits, so that's a good thing, but it does mean that we just need to be a little more aware, and it isn't going to be as simple as just, printing out the Public Housing Authority utility allowance and plugging those in. Any questions about utility allowances? All right, there is a whole list of home resources for you. I have most of these, I think all of these favorited on my computer at work, and I go to them frequently. So there's the HUD Exchange home information, tons of information there. There's the resource library, so that's where they put guides and FAQs and all sorts of things. The whole final rule, if you feel so inclined to read it yourself, it's thrilling. It's all available there for you. There's a building home primer with training manuals and slides. I already mentioned the compliance guide for home rental projects, so that's really helpful, as well as the technical guide. Do note this 2005 technical guide hasn't been fully updated, but most of it is pretty much the same. Home uses the same definition of income. The Section 8 CFR 24.5.609, I believe it is. So if you're familiar with that, you should be good to go. So if you still have home questions, read your home funder regulatory agreement. It includes, I know the cities include a lot of details about how many home units you need to have, what bedroom size they need to be, what are the applicable rents, are the home units fixed or floating. So that's all helpful information, and if you're not able to glean the answers that you're looking for from these resources, give us a call. And we did provide in the other screen our contact information on the PowerPoint slide, but again, my name is Cheryl Cohen. I'm with the City of Seattle Office of Housing, so certainly give me a call, 206-684-0366. Well, we've ended a little early. I didn't go through the whole review of the Table 1 Excel export because, again, it gets a little challenging to do it in a webinar format. But we walked through via the training site all of the validation issues. So what I would encourage you to do is look at that Table 1 Excel export and see if you can identify all of the errors as just a little homework assignment for you. And we really appreciate your willingness to go along the ride with us on all of the nuances for this particular, everyone's favorite fun source, the home program.
So I do have a question. I'm wondering about the mandatory service requirement, how this is different from the community service requirement for many low-income housing authority requirements. Would it be an amendment?
That is an excellent question. I think we would need to look at the particulars because there could be cases where there may be competing requirements. So if you're at a housing authority and there's requirements around community participation, that in my mind may not be the same as services. So I think the intent from home is for services to not have things like you're required to meet with your case manager once a week. I think there's an effort to, move toward a more progressive engagement model rather than a hard-fixed tenant, thou shall do these things, otherwise you don't get to live here anymore. So I'm not sure if that answered the question, but we may have to look at the particulars of what the requirements are and then see if there's any potential conflict with the home requirements and go from there.
Okay, we have a question. So if you have floating home units, do you need to float them, or can I keep them so long as they are in compliance?
You do not need to float them. I think a lot of property management companies, it can be easier to kind of self-impose them being fixed, if you will, just so you're assured to make sure that you're complying with all of the home requirements over time. When you start floating and moving around the home designations quite a bit, there's the risk of error or being shy a unit or it not getting floated to a comparable unit. So you can certainly do that. There's no reason why you can't, but you do have that flexibility if it's granted in your home contract.
If you are coming back this afternoon, you do want to make sure that you have the printed material. So 2 emails went out yesterday. The first email had the attachments for the home session that Cheryl just did. They also had a matrix You will need the matrix for the Digging Deeper session. And then a second email went out that had those attachments plus a couple of others. And you want to make sure that you have those other attachments printed out, or you really will be lost in the Digging Deeper session because there's a very large Excel export that you'll want to have printed. It prints on 2 legal size pieces of paper, so you'll need to have that.